Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us for our first virtual annual meeting. My name's Alan Greenberger. I'm a longtime board member of the Association for Public Art, and I'm coming to you live from our studios in Mount Airy, Philadelphia, also known as my house. I'll be your host this afternoon, and we'll take a closer look at Gerhard-Marcks and his sculpture, Maja, which was recently reinstalled on the Parkway at 22nd Street in the brand new Maja Park in front of Parktown Place Museum District residences. Our program is streamed to you via YouTube and Facebook this afternoon. It's also available on our website, associationforpublicart.org, and that'll be available immediately after this event ends. If you have any questions, you're welcome to add them to the comments section on Facebook or YouTube. Please note that you must have a Facebook or YouTube account to post your questions. However, you can also email them to us at apa@associationforpublicart.org. The Association for Public Art is the oldest public art organization in this country. We commissioned the earliest plans for the Benjamin Franklin Parkway more than 100 years ago. And as we watch the Parkway change and adapt, we continue to support ongoing developments of the space by placing and caring for a number of outdoor sculptures. We're excited to continue the mission of incorporating public sculpture into urban design by installing Gerhard-Marcks' Maja in Maja Park, as we're grateful to all the partners who help make this possible, and there are many of them. They include Patty Schwader and the AIR communities, Aparna Palantino and the Philadelphia Parks and Recs Department, Julie Bush and Ground Reconsidered, Chris Desi and the Desi Group, conservator Adam Jenkins, and so many other people. Thank you all for the support of this. This afternoon, we'll hear from the association's Executive Director and Chief Curator, Balkin Bach, Penny, as she shares Maja's long and fascinating debut and ultimate return to Philadelphia. We're also going to hear from Dr. Arie Hartog, the director of the Gerhard-Marcks-Haus, as he provides insight into the life and struggles of artist Gerhard Marx, who was living in Nazi Germany when he created Maja. Dr. Hartog will speak to us from Germany by video with a very informative presentation about the artist that we're sharing with you here for the very first time. And at the end of the presentations, Penny Bach will be joining us for a Q&A. But first, before we get into the presentations, I'd like to introduce the president of the association's Board of Trustees, my friend Barbara Aronson, who will welcome us from the Parkway site of the newly installed sculpture. Barbara?
Greetings, and thank you for joining us. I'm Barbara Aronson, President of the Association for Public Art's Board of Trustees, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you to our spring program. 2021 marks APA's 149th annual meeting, hosted since our founding in 1872. We were unable to present this event last year due to the pandemic, the first time in our nearly 150-year history. We know things look a little different this year, but we're grateful to have you here with us as we continue to provide art for everyone, anytime. Since we last met, we installed Louise Nevelson's Atmosphere and Environment and Sir Jacob Epstein's Social Consciousness to great effect on the campus of the University of Pennsylvania. You must go see them in their new location. We have also been hosting the Philadelphia iteration of Nancy Baker Cahill's Liberty Bell, an augmented reality project at the steps of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It was commissioned by Art Production Fund and is on view in 6 American cities. And with a renewed focus on the virtual this year, we've been building upon our robust self-guided tours and online experiences through our website, social media, and key partnerships and collaborations. As people took advantage of social distancing in parks and public spaces throughout the city, APA has continued to highlight public art that Philadelphians can discover or rediscover. This event is sponsored in part by our members such as you and Partners for Public Art. If you're inspired by our work, we encourage you to support this year and beyond. You can visit associationforpublicart.org/support for more information. We have a wonderful program for you today. Dr. Arie Hartog, director of the Gerhard-Marcks-Haus in Germany, will be providing an in-depth look at the life and struggles of artist Gerhard Marx, who created the Maja sculpture, which I'm standing in front of now. But first, we'll hear from APA's Executive Director and Chief Curator, Balkin Bach, who will share the fascinating story behind the sculpture and its debut in Philadelphia. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Barbara. And let me reiterate Barbara's comments about both the Nevelson piece and the Epstein piece that have been relocated to the University of Pennsylvania. I've seen them in person. They are spectacular in their setting. And I want to give a little shout out to my very close friend, David Hollenberg, now retired university architect at Penn, who was very instrumental in helping place them there. I thought they're wonderful. Please go visit them. So now I'd like to introduce Balkin Bach, APA's Executive Director and Chief Curator. Penny's a curator, she's a writer, she's an educator who provides artistic direction for our organization. And I have to say, she is also my absolute go-to person. When I have ever had a question about public art, whether it's a technical question or a philosophical question, Penny's the first person I call, and I appreciate that. Thank you, Penny. Penny's well known for her work with artists and for her pioneering and innovative approaches to understanding the history of public art and connecting public art with its audiences. And what she's going to do now is to share a fascinating story behind Maja's debut in Philadelphia from more than 70 years ago. Penny?
Greetings and well wishes to everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm standing here in the newly developed Maja Park with Maja to my back, the Parkway to my left, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art not far behind me. All of these locations have a role in understanding the complex, sometimes sinister, and ultimately heartening story behind the creation of Maja and its eventual placement here today. The pandemic and the continued racial justice movement have heightened our resolve to continue to tell the full and factual stories behind the sculptures in our city, even as we may discover some of the uncomfortable truths about public art created in years past. We have projects in the works that address these ideas and concerns, and over the next year, you'll be hearing more about those. For now, the full and factual story about Maja suggests the kind of probing questions that form a backdrop that helps us understand the sculpture and the circumstances around its creation. How did Maja wind up in Philadelphia? It was created in 1942. How did the artist and the sculpture survive World War II and the Nazi era? She's an elegant, beautiful, nude woman on a pedestal. What's so special about her? Those are the kinds of things we'll be talking about today. I want to mention that the pronunciation we're using is in the German voice, which the artist would have used, but alternative pronunciations are equally acceptable. You could call her Maja in Spanish or Maja in French. The Philadelphia part of this story begins with Ellen Phillips Samuel. She was from a philanthropic family that supported our organization and many local cultural activities. She was a member of the association in the early 20th century, but she couldn't serve on what was then an all-male board. Nonetheless, when she died in 1913, the association became a beneficiary of her estate, and she had a rather forward-thinking and expansive directive. She asked that the association exhibit the work of a wide range of international artists who might be commissioned to create new sculptures for Fairmount Park. Ultimately, over a period of 30 years, and still evolving, that directive created the Ellen Phillips Samuel Memorial along Kelly Drive. This led to a series of Sculpture International exhibitions in Philadelphia in 1933, 1940, and 1949. Widely seen by sculptors and critics as the most important exhibitions in the world at the time, the works were exhibited on the terrace and also inside the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Hundreds of works were exhibited. They were also examined, admired, and ridiculed. The exhibitions were organized by the association to identify artists for the Samuel Memorial, but also to introduce the public to contemporary sculpture. Alexander Calder's International Mobile caused a sensation. It hinted at the birth of a new kinetic art form, and it paved the way for the installation years later of Ghost, the mobile that's currently in place in the museum's Grand Stair Hall. Joe Davidson's plaster of Walt Whitman, seen on the right, was later cast in bronze and purchased by the association for installation in South Philadelphia near the Walt Whitman Bridge. In 1949, attendance was extraordinary. Over 250,000 people came to see the over 200 works on exhibition. The event was covered in the press, and Life magazine called it the world's biggest sculpture show. And they photographed 70 visiting artists seated on the grand staircase of the museum. Calder managed to place himself front and center right below his mobile. About 30% of the seated sculptors were women, rather unusual considering the time. And the African-American artists Richmond Barthay and Selma Burke were also part of the exhibition. Maja was exhibited prominently at the top of the museum steps. Many artists, critics, patrons, and visitors to the 1949 Sculpture International considered Gerhard-Marcks' Maja the most significant work on display, and it was purchased by the association along with 5 other works. The magazine Art News wrote that the purchases were rather conservative in the whole. Imagine, other artists exhibiting at the same time included those who had been more experimental or ventured further into abstraction: Brancusi, Matisse, Noguchi, Giacometti, Moore, Hepworth, Picasso, David Smith. But those artists who were to become enormously influential were neither popular nor purchased, unfortunately. Now, at the end of the exhibition, the association placed Maja on loan to the Minneapolis Institute of Art for an exhibition called Masterpieces of Sculpture. And that same year, the Philadelphia Museum acquired this beautiful drawing by Marx, now in the Prints, Drawings, and Photographs collection. Gerhard-Marcks is probably one of the most famous artists that you have never heard of. He was included in 34 exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. In an exhibition of German painting and sculpture in 1931, and in an influential 1938 exhibition of the work of the Bauhaus. And most importantly, Maja was included in a notable exhibition, Sculpture of the 20th Century. In 1952, the Philadelphia Museum of Art was the first venue for the exhibition, and it then traveled to the Art Institute of Chicago. On the cover of the accompanying catalog was Pablo Picasso's 1944 Shepherd Holding a Lamb, or Man with Sheep. It was lent by Sturgis Ingersoll, who at the time was president of the Art Museum and also vice president of our organization. And then the Ingersolls donated the work to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where you may have seen it. The exhibition culminated at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. You can see the silhouette of Maja on the lower right in the museum's outdoor sculpture garden. When Maja finally returned to Philadelphia, the sculpture was installed by the association on the East Terrace of the Art Museum. And then it was removed and placed in storage along with other nearby sculptures because the terrace was being renovated. None of those sculptures were ultimately returned to the terrace, and as Maja remained in storage, we waited for the right opportunity and the appropriate site to reinstall the sculpture. And a few years ago, we began to work on this site at 22nd and the Parkway with Philadelphia Parks and Recreation and AIR Communities, which owns the adjacent Parktown Place residences. The project was then supported by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Other partners and supporters included Council President Darrell Clark, State Senator Larry Farnese, State Representative Brian Sims, and the DESI Group. The landscape architects, Grounds Reconsidered, designed the park with Maja as the focal point, and the work was carried out by Bittenberg Bender Construction. We all wanted to create a welcoming space for the sculpture and for the public. So after almost 30 years, Maja came out of storage. And to prepare for the outdoor installation, Maja required conservation to restore and protect the sculpture's bronze surface. This work was carried out by Adam Jenkins Conservation. I want to point out that while Marx's daughter was the model for this sculpture, Maja's face is an amalgam of different ethnic features, and that offers us a universal female portrait. A state-of-the-art laser treatment delicately and meticulously removed the sculpture's streaky surface corrosion, and then a special wax coating was applied to protect the bronze from further deterioration. The treatment wasn't intended to bring the sculpture back to its shiny original appearance when it emerged from the foundry, but rather we wanted to show the surface acquired over time, and this signals that it isn't a contemporary sculpture. In the fall of 2019, we had a groundbreaking. At that time, the city decided to name the park after the sculpture, and so we're here in Maja Park. And although events of the past year slowed construction, work on the park continued slowly. Typically, it's not city government, but the public that's driven a tradition of naming parks after their sculptures. Sculptures can become landmarks, identifiers that create unique and recognizable and shared images and experiences that shape public spaces. Think Love Park, and Shakespeare Park, and Iroquois Park. The installation of Maja began in early March, overseen by Conservator Jenkins and Atelier Fine Arts. The Parkway is a work in progress. Over more than 100 years, the association has advocated for good civic design and the commissioning and placement of permanent and temporary public art. Maja Park is the latest contribution, and the city is about to embark on its next Parkway revitalization plan. Let me tell you something about Gerhard-Marcks, who was born in Germany in 1889. He was a sculptor, a printmaker, and a designer. He held teaching positions at the Bauhaus and the Halle School of Arts and Crafts. In 1933, the Nazis dismissed him from his teaching post after he tried to protect a Jewish student and Jewish colleagues. He was labeled a degenerate artist, and a number of his works were confiscated. They were melted down and repurposed for war materials. Marx relocated his studio to Berlin, and in November 1943, during the devastating Battle of Berlin, a bomb destroyed his studio, and many of his sculptures were left in pieces. But Maja, in plaster, miraculously survived and was cast in bronze once the war ended. There were aspects of Marx's life and work that were perplexing to us, and so we turned to Dr. Arie Hartog, director of the Gerhard-Marcks-Haus in Germany. How did Marx survive during the war years? Why did he remain? Was his expression censored? What was he after artistically? What about his role in terms of modernism? Dr. Hartog explained that Maja was a symbol of modernism. Modernism, although suppressed, was always alive in Germany during the war years. It's a story of the triumph of creativity and human perseverance in uncertain and threatening times. A story that Dr. Hartog himself will be revealing to you. Despite persecution for speaking out against anti-Semitism, despite countless setbacks that would have led others to give up, Marx continued his creative work, and Maja continues to remind us of the endurance of art and the important role of the artist in society.
Thank you, Penny. As always, I learn something new every time you say anything. So I really appreciate that. That was a great talk. Thanks. So Penny will be joining us for questions and answers a little later. But up next, we have a terrific presentation from Dr. Arie Hartog. Let me tell you something about him. Dr. Hartog's the director of the Gerhard-Marcks-Haus in Bremen, Germany. It's a museum for modern and contemporary sculpture inspired by the work of German sculptor and graphic artist Gerhard Marx. Hartog has written extensively about the history of 20th century sculpture, including a piece called Taking Positions, Figurative Sculpture and the Third Reich. He's a lecturer in culture and art education at the University of Bremen, a member of the German State Advisory Council for the Arts in Public Places, and serves as chair of the A.G. Bildhauer Museum, an association of sculpture museums and reconflections in Germany. Dr. Hartog will be joining us by video from the Gerhard-Marcks-Haus in Bremen. Dr. Hartog?
My name is Arie Hartog, and I'm the director of the Gerhard-Marcks-Haus in Bremen, and I'm here to tell you something about your Maja in Philadelphia. It's a special sculpture. It was made in 1942 during the Third Reich in Germany. But when Philadelphia bought the piece, they did not buy a piece from a former enemy, but from an important modernist sculptor of that time. And nowadays, we mostly do not see that modernist aspect anymore, nor do we understand the specific situation Marx was in. On the one hand, he, as an artist, needed patronage, he needed money. On the other hand, he always tried to keep an as big distance from political power. And this is a kind of situation that is always very difficult for us to understand nowadays. But let's start in Bremen, because in the early 1950s, the most famous sculpture by Marx was Maja. But nowadays, his most famous sculpture is the Bremen town musicians. And you see it here in a rather picturesque surrounding, and that is what makes it so popular. You visit the city and you want to see this picture, and all people come there and make images of it. But let's look at the work of art. The strange thing about the Bremen town musicians, and a lot of visitors complain about that, is that the donkey is too small. But why is the donkey too small? It is because Marx tries to make a triangular form. And to make that triangular form, he has to adapt nature. And that is what his art is all about. It's about an equilibrium. It's an equilibrium between, on the one hand, stereometric forms, and on the other hand, nature. And that is opposed to what you normally get as a kind of history of modern sculpture, because mostly it's being told as it starts with nature and it moves towards abstraction. And Marx is one of the sculptors who says, no, modern sculpture is about both nature and abstraction. Gerhard Marx was born in Berlin in 1889 and he died in 1981. Very early on, he decides he wants to become an artist, but he also decides he does not want to go to an arts academy. And that is an interesting position. He is interested in Rodin, the French sculptor, and he's not interested in the official art of the late German Empire. So we're talking about an artist who is interested in modernism and focused on French art. Here you see his first sculpture of a human body. It's from 1910, and it is an early example of expressionism. And you will say, huh? What's expressionist about that? But after a while, you see there's something strange with this man. If you look at his right leg, you see the right leg is much longer than the left leg. And why does Marx do that? And that is what you see here on the next picture, is to create parallel lines. There are 4 parallel lines going through the sculpture: shoulders, arms, hip, and knees. And to get this kind of position, you have to exaggerate the human proportions. In a normal standing figure, you'd have ponderation, an alteration of axes, but in this case, Marx makes parallels. So form is just as important as nature. And nowadays, we see the naked man. But 1910, people saw that's not natural. So that is a kind of a difference we are talking about. After the First World War in 1919, Gerhard Marx is one of the first teachers to be appointed at the Bauhaus by his friend Walter Gropius. And at the Bauhaus, he starts making sculptures like this one, Woman with Infant, 1919. And at first glance, you may think of medieval sculpture, especially because of the gilding. But there's something a little bit strange with this sculpture, because if you look at it closely, you will see that all forms are convex forms. The complete sculpture, except for 2 small parts with the hand of the woman, is made out of convex, big, round forms. So what Marx is doing at the Bauhaus, while his painter colleagues are thinking about what does the medium of painting mean, it is about points, lines, and planes, he says, well, sculpture is the art of volumes. So he makes sculptures and experiments with the diverse possibilities of the volume. And you can see that in the next sculpture. It's a couple. And here you see how he is playing with sculptural contrast. Big, small, flat, round. And he's trying to make a kind of a spatial composition. And you could say that for Gerhard Marx, when he was at the Bauhaus, he was responsible for the ceramics workshop, but he made about 50 sculptures when he was there. It was something like a laboratory of sculpture. He wanted to find out what are the diverse aspects of a modern sculpture. In 1925, the Bauhaus leaves Weimar and goes to Dessau, and Marx decides to go to Halle, to the Burg Giebichenstein. And this is an art school that is nowadays not too well known anymore, but it still exists, and it's one of the more important art schools in Germany. And this school, they are also trying to evolve modern art and design. Slightly different from the Bauhaus, but same modernist direction. And here Marx develops his own form. And the interesting thing is, at the Bauhaus, you can see how stereometric patterns, how abstract form becomes more and more important. And then during his period at the Burg Giebichenstein, nature, you could say, comes back. And there comes this equilibrium between the two. Here you see on the right a plaster, on the left, sorry, a marble sculpture made around 1930, and with these sculptures he became famous. This was how people thought that modernist sculpture would become. On the one hand, abstraction, on the other hand, nature. So when Alfred J. Barr, the founding director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, planned an exhibition on modern German art, Marx was one of the youngest sculptors. And in 1932, he gets an exhibition at the famous gallery of Alfred Flechtheim in Berlin. And you could say, for an artist at that time, that was, when it comes to the kind of international fame for an artist, if you were at that gallery, well, you had it made, or you made it. And then things change dramatically. In the meantime, Marx has become the director of the Burg Giebichenstein in Halle, and in this position, he protests against the dismissal of Jewish colleagues in 1933 after the National Socialists seized powers. As a result, he himself is dismissed and he returns to Berlin. And what then happens is that his works in public collections are being confiscated during the degenerate art actions. And at these exhibitions in Munich and later on in Berlin and other cities, Marx is being presented as a terrible artist from the degenerate period of German art. And here you see a very famous photo of the propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels visiting the exhibition in Berlin, and the sculpture to the right is by Gerhard Marx. And if you were in that exhibition as an artist, you were done. There was no possibility to get anything from an official point of view. But Marx, in the early 1930s, he already had found patronage, so there were different people who are still working, still buying from him. And what is also very important, some people who had emigrated to the United States after 1933, they were still buying until 1940. So you have the strange situation of an artist living in Germany, trying not to cooperate with the regime, and on the other hand, well, you trying to surf between the different positions. And for us nowadays, it's very difficult to understand that position of an artist. We would say, well, was he still working as an artist? Couldn't he do something else? No, he was absolutely sure he wanted to be a modern artist, even under these very difficult circumstances. And that is the, you could say, ideological background of Maja. The expressionist work of Gerhard Marx, we understand that the National Socialists did not like it. But the interesting thing is they also forbade him to exhibit his newer works. Here you see Johannes, a sculpture from 1936, and he was officially reprimanded and he was told not to exhibit these sculptures. And when you look at it, you understand why. Because what does Marx do? He has understood that the Third Reich has a certain idea of masculinity. And what he does is he puts that in reverse. His boy has broad hips and very small shoulders. and the way the boy holds his hands makes him a hyacinth. So he is the lover of Apollo. And all these it's not a boy who will go to war. And that is one of the reasons why when you look closely at these sculptures, you understand, okay, it's a figurative sculpture. It was made during the Third Reich in Germany, but it's something different. When you look then at Maja, it even becomes more interesting. Maja is one of the very few overlife-size sculptures by Marx. We know only of 2 autonomous sculptures over life size. When he made over life size, it was mostly for a public commission, because for when you have it in open space, but for a sculpture to be presented in a room, he would not make a over life size sculpture. The other one is this sculpture of standing man, which you see on the right side. And the funny thing is, the one is his son, the other one is his daughter. So that is the first link. The other link is, look at the arms. It has something to do with the posture. We'll come back to that. And what we know from Marx's diary, and that is very intriguing, is that for Maja, it is one of the few sculptures where he made a model, half size, so 1 meter 10. First he made that model, and then he enlarged it to make that. And that is a very clear sign that he was trying to make a statement. It was not just the next sculpture, but it was like, I am now going to make a big one, and I'm going to plan it, and it has to be good. That is the kind of background of this figure. The big problem for modernist sculptors is hands and arms. This. The very moment you see a sculpture with a gesture, it wants something from you. So it's a storytelling sculpture. And modernist sculptors that were following, especially Rodin, came to the idea around 1920 that you should try to make a sculpture that is, on the one hand, related to nature, but it should not be a storytelling sculpture. So the easy way is chop the arms off. But the other way is keep the arms to the body, the way I am doing now. And the funny thing is, if you would go through the oeuvre of Gerhard Marx, you would see that there is one sculpture where the figure does this. But all his other sculptures, the arms and the hands are on the body, so that there is no gesture going out, no kind of telling something. And the sculpture you see on the right is Atlas' Tochter, the daughter of Atlas from 1936. It's the other daughter of Gerhard Marx. And if you saw that, you think, oh, Maja is also one of the daughters of Atlas. So there is this kind of in-cheek relationship between those two. I'll come back to the title later on. If you look at the motive of Atlas' daughter and then at Maja, you will see that the whole spatial concept is much more complex. And this is also the reason probably why Marx started to plan it. But there are also very intriguing relationships to other sculptors working in Berlin at that time. There was a studio, the so-called Klosterstraße, where artists were working that kept a distance to the regime. The most famous artist working there was Käthe Kollwitz. And Marx is in this circle. And here you see, on the one hand, Maja, on the other hand, a sculpture by Ludwig Kasper. And Ludwig Kasper was one of these sculptors who said, well, if we want to stay modernist, we have to remove ourselves more and more from nature. And we should look at Egyptian and Asian art sculpture. So he makes a very kind of architectural sculpture. He would always say the most important thing about a sculpture is architecture. But Marx says, yes, you are right. Sculpture is about architecture, but do not forget nature. For me, sculpture is about this kind of equilibrium. So this is the kind of sculptural discourse that is going on. And you must not forget that since 1937, since this Degenerate art exhibition, there was something developing like a National Socialist aesthetic. And people like Caspar and Marx, they were very clear on it, and they said what these people are doing as an official art is bad sculpture. So for us as German sculptors, we must now make good sculpture. This is a very intriguing thing. You think that a political discussion only is being discussed by political means, but here it is working in art. We know that both Marx and Caspar thought that a sculptor like Arno Breker was a bad sculptor. So in this situation, it was all about making decent modernist sculptures. And when you compare the two, on first hand, you think, oh, two nude women. But the very moment you look at the way these sculptures were made and the whole concept that is behind it, you see the differences. And these differences may be subtle. They may be difficult for us to see nowadays, but they're essential. One of the things is the role of nature and of idealization. Marx always said the worst thing to do in a sculpture is to idealize something. The sculpture should never be about how someone should look like. Never about beauty. It should be about a decent, formally built sculpture. And a sculpture should never be about fat. A sculpture should never be about muscles. All these aspects. And the very moment you then look at Arno Breker, by the way, look at her gesture. She wants something. It is, he is not interested in these kind of details, whereas Breker does his utter best to make all these kind of details into a sculpture. When you are standing in front or behind of Maja, it doesn't matter, you will see that the sculpture is very clearly built up around axes and forms. And it's not about the depicted woman. She is the inspiration. That's where it starts, but nothing more. And that is the big difference to the more idealizing concept that you will find within the Nazi sculpture. The difference is subtle, like I said, but it's important. In 1943, then, Berlin is during a bombing of Berlin, Marx's studio is destroyed. And most of his works are gone. And as by miracle, Maja survives. It's one of the few sculptures from that period that has survived. And that then makes an important part of the story. Then, because after the Second World War, when cultural life in Germany restarts, there is one big sculpture from a modernist position, and that is Maja. No other sculptor at that time has made such a big, bold, modernist statement. There have been a lot of small sculptures by which you can see that these sculptors did not adapt to the Nazi aesthetic, but Marx made a big one. And as Marx is also one of the sculptors who had never cooperated with the party, he becomes a kind of a showcase German modernist. It is also very important to understand that this sculpture was titled Woman with Arms Over Her Head. And in 1946, it received the title Maja. And there was a pun in there. There was this link to the daughter of Atlas. This is also a daughter of Atlas. And the pun, the irony is, of course, that the artist is Atlas. He is the guy who is carrying the burden of German tradition under these difficult circumstances. At that time, most people understood the joke. Nowadays, nobody understands that joke anymore. But it's, I think, very important. And it's because of, you should not interpret this sculpture in a standard mythological way. It is not a depiction of a Greek mythology story. It is not a depiction of any goddess or something like that. No, the content that comes from via the title comes from the context. And that is the reason why in 1949 Maja was brought to Philadelphia, because it was a modernist sculpture. It showed that even in those difficult times during dictatorship in Germany, there still had been modernist sculpture. The work was bought, and that gave Marx's career an enormous boost, because he was a German sculptor, and now a big American city had bought one of his pieces, and it would become the most beloved work of him among sculpture lovers. So when in 1952, the MoMA organized an exhibition on sculpture of the 20th century, you would find Gerhard Marx next to Laurent. And in this story, Marx would represent a moderate modernism. But it was clear for everybody, it's not about a woman holding her arms over her head, but it is about the forms the sculptor made out of that, the way that sculpture works into space. And that is the reason why it's so great that the sculpture is now being installed in Philadelphia, so that you can, on the one hand, knowing this story, you can go there and look at it as a modernist sculpture, look at the forms, look at the axes, forget the title. You may think about the context, the story, and I wish you fun looking at it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to Dr. Arie Hartog for joining us. Thank you for that presentation. My name is Caitlin Martin. I'm the Senior Communications and Marketing Manager for the Association for Public Art. Unfortunately, Alan had some technical hiccups, so I'll be joining you for the end of the event today and bringing Penny Balkin Bach, our Executive Director and Chief Curator, on to answer some questions for us. So Penny will be joining us now as I provide her with some questions. You're welcome to add some in the chat, either on Facebook or YouTube, or you can email us at apa@associationforpublicart.org. And we did receive some questions in advance that I'm excited to ask Penny. So Penny, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm happy to be here, of course.
And happy to be nimble here and moderate the questions. So thanks for working with me on that as well. So I have a few questions. We'll go ahead and start. The first is, why exactly, if known, was Marx's work deemed degenerate?
I guess it's the seminal question, really. Degenerate was a term that was used by the Nazis to to identify artworks, but also artists. And it really had to do with whether they considered the works to be undermining Nazi principles, if they thought the work or the artist was a communist, or if the work or artist was Jewish or the work had Jewish attributes. So it was an overall sort of catch-all for works that were not useful to the Nazi propaganda machine. And interestingly, Marx was neither ethnic Jewish nor was he a communist. So but his work was deemed degenerate. I think, my point of view, it was really for two main reasons. And the reasons I think that come through with Dr. Hartog's such an informative presentation. And one is that it was actually an exclusion and punishment to him. His work didn't carry this message of the Nazi ideal Aryan. And then secondly, I think it was also in retaliation for his political position when he defended Jewish students and colleagues. So various artists were deemed degenerate for different reasons. It would appear that those were the reasons that come to mind thinking about Gerhard Marx. And I would also refer the questioner and the audience to a wonderful essay that we commissioned by Dr. Paul Jascott. Dr. Jascott is a professor at the Duke University, and his work revolves around the political history of Nazi art and also its post-war cultural impact. And you can access that essay on our website. If you go to the Maja page, it's one of the links. We, in commissioning that essay and in also inviting Dr. Hartog to speak with us, we really wanted to understand better the backstory behind this sculpture, and their contributions really enriched my understanding, I think all of our understanding of how it was, did the work that he did and how he managed really to survive during that period.
That's great, Penny. And I'm actually seeing that Alan was able to join us again. So thank you, Alan.
Hi, thank you. Sorry about that. I haven't the faintest idea what happened, but I did what all tech people have taught me to do. I shut everything off and I turned it back on.
That's the perfect way to answer the tech problems always. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move back to the behind the curtain and let Alan and Penny take over with the Q&A.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Okay, well, Penny, this is a two-part question. It says, Maya's strong, calm, and solemn face do not reflect what was then, ? And now, considered to be consistent with the desirable, quote unquote, classic Greek aspirational statuary. And so, did Marx deliberately choose to reflect not simply engagingly realistic form and expression, but perhaps, what do you think, Mediterranean, Slavic, Middle Eastern features? What do you think?
Well, Marx was definitely influenced by classical Greece, and he traveled there often. He actually had a house on a Greek island. And he had, even though he was influenced by the classical tradition, he really had a progressive worldview. He traveled widely. He traveled to Italy to work there, to Spain. Eventually, he went to South Africa and Mexico. So it isn't really surprising that his portraiture, in this case, appears to be an amalgam of what he both perceived and also observed. He also believed, as you could see from the various works that Dr. Hartog showed, that he thought that beauty was not necessarily associated with perfection. So Maya's face and also her body neither reflects a classical idea. She's very bulky and solid with her feet firmly on the ground. So on the whole, really the classical influence is there, but I think that Marx really was after something very different, very universal, very expressionistic, as Dr. Hartog mentioned.
Right, and you know, this idea of perfection itself is sort of a one-sided story. So the idea that he might have reached out to other cultures that he had experienced, I don't think is, I mean, from my perspective, I don't see it as sort of reaching out. I think it's simply an acknowledgement that there's different kinds of people worldwide, and this notion of perfection is a manufactured one at some level.
Mm-hmm.
Well, here's another question. What was Marx's role during his time spent at the Bauhaus? Do you know?
I know a little bit about that. He knew Walter Gropius very well, and Gropius founded the Bauhaus in 1919. And he invited Marx to be one of the first 3 teachers at the Bauhaus. And interestingly enough, he ran the pottery workshop. He was called the form master. It's interesting in reflection because form turned out to be probably, you know, the most significant aspect of his lifelong investigation. So one could say that, you know, taking the time during that period and looking at form in any media, in this case pottery, really served him well for the future. Of course, the Bauhaus was shut down a few years later, and that was when he went to various arts and crafts schools in Germany to teach.
It's an interesting little factoid because pottery, while there's certainly straight line pottery, so much of pottery is more rounded.
Mm-hmm.
That connects to something.
You could see that in a couple of the images that Arie showed.
Yeah.
You know, there's a very linear. He was also known to draw on the pottery of his students. So there was also this idea of collaboration that he thought was sort of a worthy experience in terms of someone's education.
Or terrifying to students. I mean, being in that position, both as a student originally and now as a teacher. I'm never sure how that goes over, but interesting point. Are there other questions? So what were Marx's contemporaries that were also considered degenerate?
Well,
or not what, who?
Judging from that 1937 exhibition, there were like over 600 pieces in that exhibition, and most of them were German artists, which would have included his degenerate contemporaries, like Kurt Schwitters, also Paul Klee, were both included in that. But also interestingly was that there were a number of foreign artists because the Nazis removed the work of artists from the German state museums and declared those degenerate also. And so part of the exhibition was these foreign artists, and they included Picasso, Mondrian, Chagall, Kandinsky. And so Marx was actually in pretty good company, you could say. I should also add that the Museum of Modern Art has a digital exhibition online that showcases works from the Degenerate art exhibition, if anyone is interested in looking further.
You know, as far away ago as this all seems, I mean, for many of us, our parents were alive when this was happening. It's rather shocking. Are there other questions? Well, here's one. When the sculpture was purchased, did the association intend to keep it on the museum's East Terrace? Why didn't it go back there?
Good question. There is an answer. I hope it's satisfactory. But when Maja moved to the rear of the terrace, it was installed as part of an installation of small-scale sculptures. So it was one of a number of sculptures. So when the terrace was renovated, the museum realized that half of the sculptures belonged to others. And so they returned some of the sculptures to their original owners. And so Maja basically, came back to the association. And at that point, there really wasn't an exhibition of small-scale sculpture to go back to the terrace. And that was when we decided, APA, the association, decided to look for another location, which is, from our point of view, it's not a simple thing because we're interested in issues of scale, of context, in this case, historic context. So when the opportunity to work with Parks and Rec and AIR on the small park became an option, it seemed like a perfect location for this sculpture because, of course, it became the focal point of the park, but also we were able to position Maja in the same juxtaposition as she was on the art museum steps, that is, with the Parkway in front of her and the museum behind her. No offense intended, but so that is such a nice historic opportunity to be able to, on the one hand, recreate something, but on the other hand, give it a totally new and contemporary life.
Great, thanks. Here's one from Susan Hagan. She said, I love this sculpture at its last location near the museum. It's interesting to see it reinstalled on a lower, more human level. Was this a consideration in choosing the site?
I think to some degree, yes. And also, it's a human scale environment as well. And I think that the landscape architects, Grounds Reconsidered, accentuated the human scale of that location. It's interesting to think of that site before Maja and before the park. I almost can't imagine it differently, but it was almost a throwaway location. I think most people wouldn't have even identified it as a site. Probably the people moving from the residences to the Parkway would have understood it as a site, but it really wasn't. It was a throwaway location. So the fact that Maja can then, come down at pedestrian scale and really create an interaction that didn't exist before, I think is really fantastic.
Yeah, I agree with you, Penny. I don't think anybody even thought it was a site, and I really appreciate the cooperation from folks at Parktown to make this possible. I think their creativity and imagination helped this cause greatly. Here's a question from Judy Krieger-Rogers. Does APA have additional sculptural treasures in storage awaiting perfect installation spots? I like this one.
Well, interestingly, I think some people do think we have a little warehouse where we pull things out. No, the answer is pretty much no. We have some sculptures in storage that were part of an international sculpture garden that we had at one point installed down at Delaware Avenue. And those were removed when that area began to change in terms of use and an environment. So we are thinking of where those sculptures might be reinstalled. And again, they have their own very so it's probably another couple of years of searching, hunting, and finding great partners to work with. That's part of it too.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. Did Marx ever visit Philadelphia to see his work installed on the terrace?
It's possible. The first thing we did was try to look for him in that Life magazine photograph of 70 sculptors. He was very identifiable with his kind of shock of white hair, but we don't think he was in that photograph. Therefore, wouldn't have been there for the opening of the exhibition. But we do know that he visited Philadelphia in 1950. Because he was considered actually for an artwork at Samuel Memorial, and it was a commission that he didn't get. He also had a New York gallery, the Bauhaus gallery, and so he visited the U.S. periodically for exhibitions. So we think there's a good chance that he did see the work at that location. We haven't found any actual documentation of that fact yet.
Well, they sure dressed interestingly in that photograph. Amazing. Well, we're going to wrap this up now. So I just want to thank you, Penny, once again, and certainly thank Arie for these great presentations. Incredibly informative. We are surrounded in this city by extraordinary art, and to be able to dive a little deeper and get the background on this particular piece at this particular site, I think is just a great treasure. Thank you for that. So I do want to remind our audience that the association is almost 150 years old. This goes back a long way, and an awful lot of the art that you see and experience in this city from time to time came as a result of this organization. And by attending events like this, you're supporting this organization. But guess what? It's also a membership organization, and you can join APA and continue to support what we do by heading to the old website, associationforpublicart.org, and here's the important part, /membership. I also want to give thanks to all of our partners who worked with us to make the return of Maja to the Parkway possible, and I want to thank the association staff for all their hard work. None of these things ever happen without a lot of people behind the scenes, although today you saw one of the behind the scenes people, really making things happen. In particular, I want to thank Caitlin Martin, who you did see earlier, and Ashley Lapolis for this just incredible amount of work to make this happen. As I mentioned, this recording will be available on our website, and we'll be sure to share the link with the attendees via email. For now, the world seems to be opening up again. I'm sure we all couldn't be happier with nice weather coming at the same time. So for everybody, be safe, be healthy, get vaccinated. And thanks again for joining us today. We'll see you soon.